Some argue that food is first and foremost a social good. Here we explore the right to food and food sovereignty as two key concepts used to defend this position. Let's start with the right to food. According to the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the right to adequate food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, has the physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means for its procurement. When trying to achieve the progressive realization of the right to adequate food, many proponents advance the so-called Panther Principles. These are 7 principles for human rights. Let's take a moment to review these human rights principles. The first is participation, which means that everyone has the right to participate in the decisions that affect them. Second is accountability, meaning that government officials are to be held accountable for their actions. Third, non-discrimination, which means that there should be no arbitrary difference of treatment in decision-making. Number 4 is transparency, which means that people are able to understand relevant processes, decisions, and outcomes. Fifth, human dignity, which means that people are treated in a dignified way. Number 6 is empowerment, which means that people are in a position to exert control over decisions affecting their own lives. And finally, the 7th principle is the rule of law, meaning that every member of society must comply with the law. Now, let's take a moment to think about food sovereignty. This is the second key concept used by those who promote food as a social good, and it's also defined by a set of principles, 6 of them in fact. Before we look at these, let's first define food sovereignty as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. This definition is taken from the Declaration of Naileni. This is a declaration that was developed at a meeting of more than 500 representatives from more than 80 countries of organizations of peasants and family farmers, artisanal fishers, indigenous peoples, landless peoples, rural workers, migrants, pastoralists, forest communities, women, youth, consumers, and on top of that, environmental and urban movements. And all of these people met in Mali in 2007. Now, the declaration that they agreed to outlines 6 pillars for food sovereignty. The first pillar calls for a focus on food for people and is thus clearly linked to food as a social good. The second pillar is to value food providers. The third is to localize food systems. This is a direct call to move away from a focus on food production for international trade and instead calls for producing food for local people first. Proponents of this idea argue that it's key to address the sad fact that the majority of the world's hungry are also food producers. They argue that the right to food of these people is left behind as governments and in turn policies and programs favor industrial agriculture and trade. The fourth pillar is then to put control locally. This means that food systems are not just focused on first ensuring local populations have food, but that the local populations actually control the processes that feed them. The fifth pillar is that food sovereignty should build on existing knowledge and skills, especially that of existing food producers, but also people who eat the food. And the final pillar is to work with nature. This is a key point that we don't have time to address in more detail, but there are important discussions to have and decisions to be made about the trade-offs between industrial agriculture and the environment. So to summarize, we saw that those promoting food as a social good push for the adoption of rights-based approaches, such as those that apply the Panther Principles and food sovereignty. This position is important in the debate on the role of international trade and food access.